Welcome to one of our podcast talk type things. This one from our Death and Glory season at Chelmsford Wood Baptist Church. We had a shed talk. Now a shed talk has become a tradition of ours and one of the things we do. It's a short talk followed by open discussion, and we try not to make it preachy. We try and make it a genuinely open conversation, and generally speaking with the shed talks we pick subjects that actually are interesting to anyone, whatever your faith is, whatever your background is. There's interesting subjects. So we've talked about evolution, and we've talked about law, and we've talked about music, and on this particular instance, one of those anyway, we had a conversation around heaven and hell. So this is the full talk. We haven't put the questions in. We might take a look and see if any of them will work, but I don't think they will. And this is the main talk, which has got some pictures which won't be that clear because we videoed the talk live, but it gives you an idea of the presentation that was given on heaven and hell and how I would understand the Christian understanding on heaven and hell. Now we do have a much fuller talk planned for this season with Matt Arnold, who is something of an expert on this matter, and he studied the evolution of the thoughts about the afterlife, the beliefs around the afterlife throughout the Bible, so going right from the beginning of the Old Testament right through to the end in Revelation. And of course after that, that's when the church really went to town and started bringing in flames and pitchforks, and Bosch started, I don't know what he was on, but drawing all kinds of weird stuff. So anyway, that aside, here is the shed talk. I say if you find this subject interesting, do tune in when it appears on our YouTube channel to the main talk, which goes into much more depth over heaven and hell and what that's all about. Well, let's find out now. Heaven and hell, what's that all about? So we'll start with some pictures. I'm going to start with hell, because that way it can only get better.
You've got a picture of hell?
Yes.
I'm impressed.
I've been there on holiday. Anyway, I won't be rude about any countries, because I'm going to video this, and if they're watching they go, well, I live there and you said it's awful. Anyway, so here's a few pictures of all that says shed talk. This is why there's no content. I've just spent all day doing pictures.
42.
Yeah? So here is Bosch. I think he's great, and he's really, really early in the medieval period, isn't he? You think that's so surreal. You think that's going to be 18th or 19th or 20th century. It's ancient. He must have been on something. I don't know. Have you looked carefully at this? On Twitter, which I don't use anymore, X, there's a Bosch bot, and they just take they give you a tiny picture every day, and it's weird. So that's Bosch. I think that's Bosch. Yes, it is. That's Bosch. Yeah. You can come up and have a closer look at these later if you want. I mean, one of the bad things about hell is no one appears to have any clothes. You know, I don't know what's going on there.
Is it
too hot? I don't know.
Is that meant to be Jesus pulling up the drawbridge?
Where? Yes. Oh no, actually I think this one, I should have researched this. I think this is the harrowing of hell. So I think that's Jesus coming in, as it says in the Bible, to kick ass. I think he's going to come and sort it out. Yeah, so I think that's the harrowing of hell. Feel free to correct me later, but quietly, so I don't get embarrassed. There's another nice one. I can't remember where this one, I didn't clock them all, but this has got nice coloured demons. There's some green ones in there, which is good. Very strange imagery. And I'm not sure what's going on up here. Oh, these are the saintly ones up, because they're all clothed and with shiny armour. So they're obviously good. The bad ones are all very feral and nudie. Here's Hades. So Hades comes up. So this is the god Hades. It's only a representation. We don't actually know what he looks like. And do you know the name of his dog? Cerberus. Yeah. He's cool. It's quite. I just put this because it's a nice picture. So Hades is a god and also his realm became known as Hades. He's on the other side of the river Styx, isn't he? The river Styx. Does the river Styx mean hate? I think it means hate, which you have to cross. You have to pay the ferryman, despite what Christopher Berg tells you. You must pay him, or you can't get across. And you've also got to get past the dog, Cerberus. It's quite cool. Here's a contemporary interpretation of hell. Very, very cheery, very friendly. Nice kind of image there of everyone falling in. There's the lake of fire. Art, hell truth, blogspot. I'm not prejudging Carlos S, but I suspect hell truth, blogspot, the truth bit may be stretching it somewhat. But you can draw your own conclusions. So that's the lake of fire. Looks a bit warm there. There's another lake of fire, this time with skeletons, which is nice. Another nice cheery image. Volcanoes, skeletons. And there's a classic demon eating people. It's nice stuff. That might be the last one for now. Yeah. So what's next on there? Oh, there. Yeah, we'll go there. So you've probably all seen pictures like that in films or wherever you look at pictures in art galleries, books. Pictures are available in many places. So let's have a look then. So if you start with the Old Testament, now I'm not going to do an in-depth talk on all of the places because that's coming up at the end of or middle of October. We've got a guy coming in who'll give us a full lecture of the whole development of the biblical understanding. So we're just going to kind of dance through it. So in the Old Testament, you don't have hell. You have a place called Sheol or Sheol. Now that's a Hebrew word, and it's not hell. And Sheol is actually the underworld. So for the Jewish people at that time, they thought there was a kind of shadowy cave under the ground that everyone, when you died, you went and inhabited there. And if you come to the lecture by Matt Arnold a bit later, he will talk to you about some of the portals that are in the geography of the land. But the idea of Sheol there's no fire in Sheol. It's just cold and grey, and that's it. And that's the afterlife. And for most of the Old Testament, that's the afterlife that people thought. That's what they thought it was. When you died, that's everyone goes to Sheol. Yeah, that's it. Then we get to the New Testament, and the New Testament starts to get a bit more involved. So in the New Testament, you have three words that get translated as hell. Now, one of them is Hades. Now, sometimes in translations now, they'll use the word Hades. This is why, and you'll know we've come across this issue on other areas when we look at the Bible. It's partly about the translation. So you can say, well, the Bible says this. Well, does it? Because words get translated. So some people will translate Hades as hell. But the word isn't hell. The word that's used is clearly Hades. And as we just said, Hades is Greek underworld run by the god Hades with the dog and everything else. So when they translate the word hell, they're bringing a different understanding, or they're painting over that word, because they knew all the contemporary readers would have known what Hades was. There is also in the New Testament, have you come across Gehenna? Gehenna is another word that you get in Greek. That's the Greek version. And Gehenna is, again, sometimes translated, or very often translated, as hell. So it could be either of these words being used when you read the word hell in the Bible, but they're very different places. So if you're reading it in the Greek and you saw the word Hades, you'd think, oh, Hades. If you saw the word Gehenna, you think, oh, Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is likely to be based on a valley in Israel where in ancient times, in the Old Testament, there was the worship of the god Moloch, and child sacrifices took place. And it became basically a place of terror and a place of horror and a place of fire. So when people talk about Gehenna, that's the kind of imagery they were using. And over time, before the time of Jesus, the Jewish thought had kind of developed the idea of Gehenna into this place of punishment and purging. So it had started to arrive, the flaming idea had started to develop in the thought of God's people, but it hadn't actually been finalised by this point. So they're still talking about Hades, They're still talking about Gehenna. And they also talk about Sheol every now and then. And also, to make things a bit more confusing, you also have this place that gets a mention. Tartarus. You see, anyone heard of Tartarus?
Yeah.
So Tartarus pops up just once. I think it's in one of the books of Peter. Tartarus, again, is a Greek hell. It's a Greek version of hell. Now, don't know the Greek origins of Tartarus. Who was thrown into Tartarus? Do you know?
Yeah, God of War, God of War.
See, the God of War game would be based on this. So there's lots of games now. There's loads of games that are based on some of these characters and places. So Tartarus was a place where the Titans, who are the kind of ancient Greek gods, were thrown into for punishment. And then as the Greek mythology developed, other people started getting thrown in as well. So Tartarus was also a place of suffering and punishment that the gods generally were thrown into, although some mortals did get thrown in. So none of those three, Gehenna, Tartarus, Hades, are Christian as such. The Christian's language started, or the Christian Bible started using them, but the actual concept, the ideas, are from Greek mythology or from Jewish thinking. So, just checking I've got all that there, yes? So there's very little so far, you may be disappointed, there's very little hellfire and damnation so far occurring. But all of these words are translated very often as hell when you get to the Bible. So what the hell then is hell? Why do we use the word hell? Now the word hell, some of you might know, is Norse. It's Old English. And it's based on, I don't think she was a goddess, I think she was a giant. She was a daughter of Loki, you know Loki, the Norse god. One of his daughters was Hel, and she wasn't very nice. No offence if you're watching Hel. But she ended up with her own place that she was in charge of, which was also called Hell. So the word hell then, in Europe, became associated with that thinking, which is Norse, Viking, Old English. And then that word hell gets overlaid onto these ideas: Jewish, Greek, ancient Greek, cold, shadowy, fiery, punishy. So you can see how you get all these ideas start mixing around, which makes it, I think, very fascinating. And one of the things I think it shows is the way that words get affected by the imagery you associate with them. And then also, when you get that imagery, you then start changing the meaning of the words. Everything starts changing meaning because you've got an idea here and you've got a word here, and then they start crossing over and they start feeding into each other. And you start getting, a more positive example, if you like, from the New Testament is the word love. Now, some of you probably know, in the New Testament, I think it's 5 words for love. And they have a different emphasis. There's like family love, and love between partners, and love between siblings, and they all have a slightly different emphasis. But when you get to the English translations of the Bible, most of them just use the word love. They use one word to translate 5 different nuanced meanings. And it's the same with this. So we've got all these other ideas, and then we've just chucked the word hell on it, and then we take it from there, really, as a culture. And our thinking gets affected by that. So where does the current... we should have moved on. Where does the current idea of hell come from then? The hellfire and damnation that's very popular with some people. This is what most of us think, isn't it? Particularly in the West. When you talk about hell, this is the kind of image that you generally think of. And it is almost always medieval. Unless you're a horror film fan, I guess, then you might have a slightly different take on it. But the medieval church is really what emphasised this, and people like Bosch, with his kind of horrific and fantastic artwork, really influenced it. It repeated the words and the associations, and it makes for a good story, doesn't it? Flames and demons, all that kind of stuff. But at its root, all of that thinking is based in pagan Greek mythology. Fire, punishment, all that kind of stuff. Because biblically, there is no place like this. That's just not there. It's nowhere to be found in the Bible. There's no place where the devil is in charge and he's got all these demons around him that are prodding people with pointy sticks or eating them. It's just not there. It's been made up within the medieval church. So where, they've got to come somewhere there. Why the fiery obsession? And I would say that that's probably come from Revelation. So if you throw that out, because that's not a thing. A lot of the fiery imagery is come from the book of Revelation. Now, if you've read the book of Revelation recently, which some of us have, because we're good like that, we've been exploring really, well, what is that about? What goes on in the book of Revelation? And the book of Revelation is full of fire and blood. There's no doubt about that. There's stuff all over the place, certainly in the first sort of 3/4 of it. But it's also a book that is full of peace and of life and of hope and of restoration. But one of the things we found, and I think that we drew out, is that people don't talk about that bit very much because it's not as interesting as demons running around with lots of heads and coming out of the sea. That's what you remember. Anyway, we'll get on to the nice bit of Revelation in a bit. Well, there's a bit of Revelation. So, in the book of Revelation, you have the idea of people being put in a fire. And then you get the church coming up with this. The only word I can use to describe it is nonsense. This stuff, where God is somehow gleefully getting his angels to throw people into a pit of fire. And I'll tell you where they got it from in a moment. But so in Revelation, although there is fire and this kind of thing, people seem to delight in the emphasis on the battle and the fights that are going on. And it talks about who gets into heaven and who doesn't in the book of Revelation. First of all, though, I will read you a bit about a lake in heaven. So you might know this. We're still on hell, by the way. I thought we were jumping into heaven, but we haven't quite finished with hell yet. So, in Revelation chapter 10, the devil who deceived the people was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet had already been thrown, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So that's quite grim, isn't it? Really. So the devil, the beast, all the baddies have been chucked in because they lost the fight in the end of it. But then, if you read on, I saw a great white throne, and the one who sits on it. Earth and heaven fled from his presence and were seen no more. And I saw the dead, great and small alike, standing before the throne. Books were opened, and then another book was opened, the book of the living. The dead were judged according to what they'd done, as recorded in the books. And then the sea gave up its dead. Death and the world of the dead also gave up the dead they held. And all were judged according to what they'd done. And then death and the world of the dead were thrown into the lake of fire. This lake of fire is the second death. Whoever didn't have their names written in the book of the living were thrown into the lake of fire. So there's two things to note there. One is that death and the world of the death, you could say, well, that's hell. Hades, I think is the word that's used here, gets thrown out, gets emptied out. God shakes everyone out, and then he throws it away. There is no eternal hell in the Bible. It gets destroyed. The place that is hell. It never was the devil's. And at the end of time, according to this story, if you're going to say, well, the Bible says this, the Bible says at the end of time, hell gets chucked away. And there is a lake of fire that it gets chucked into. And this is the second death. So again, that's a confusing phrase. Does that mean they're dead? How can you be dead forever while you're still alive? So I don't know. So some people would argue for that. Well, actually, there's a point when God says enough and it finishes. And other people argue, well, actually the devil and all of his angels are in a kind of eternal quarantine. They're put into the lake of fire and that's where they stay. That's it. It's not their realm, it's their prison that God puts them into. And he also might like to note, which we may come to later, that everyone is judged, and everyone is judged according to what they had done, not what they had believed, which is another interesting note for some wings within the church. So death, hell, they're chucked in the fire, they get burnt up, they get incinerated and finished and ended. And those whose name isn't in the book of life, There's no torment. There's no devil tormenting anyone. They're all destroyed. But look into the next picture. And a heavenly city, a very pixelated heavenly city, descends. Because after the lake of fire incident, the next breath says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth disappeared and vanished, and I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." So once the lake of fire stuff's done with, we move on to the heavenly city descending into the place. It's a gear change, because once the heavenly city appears, unless I've not noticed it, the lake of fire doesn't get another mention, because the heaven has arrived. The old things have gone, and the new heaven and the new earth have appeared. Now you could possibly draw a map, and I've seen some kooky stuff on the internet where people have, they've drawn this glorious shiny heavenly city, and then this dirty great big lake of fire right next door. You wouldn't build a house there, would you? Think of the insurance. It doesn't really make any sense. But this is another thing. Whatever you read in Revelation, never try and draw it, because it's not a three-dimensional thing we're talking about here. Anyway, so if you read on to the heavenly city in Revelation 21, 27, if I can focus. The gates of the city will stand open all day. That's those gates. I think it's 12 gates, isn't it? The gates of the city stand open all day, and they'll never be closed, because there will be no night. The greatness and the wealth of the nations will be brought into the city, but nothing that is impure will enter the city, nor anyone who does shameful things or tells lies. Well, hang on a minute. Aren't they all in the fire? Come on. Get your story straight. I think what we're talking about is different images of what happens at the end. So when you get this gear change the book of Revelation is very much about, you're going to get your comeuppance. Everyone is, for better or for worse. That will come. Things will be put right. So you can take that as a negative, God's going to come in with a big stick, or you can take it as God's going to come in and sort everything out. You're going to put right all those things that were wrong. So after the punishment aspect of Revelation is done, so it starts off, the book of Revelation starts off with a lot about martyrdom and suffering and God's people and what they go through, and about the evil of the world empires. Then it moves into the fight. The fight is over, the punishment happens, and then the whole thing shifts gear, and a new picture appears, which is this heavenly city. And in this heavenly city, the gates are open all the time, and there are people who don't go in, or who won't go in, or who can't go in. There's nothing stopping them going in. So on that basis, if you had just read Revelation 21, you would say, well, hell is a separation from God, isn't it? It's being outside of God's presence, outside the city. If you just read Revelation chapter 20, you think, well, there's a dirty great big fire. That's where you get chucked. They're two very clear images, but they're completely different, which is why you cannot argue this one is the one. You have to say, well, what are they saying? What are these symbols trying to get across? Anyway, that's enough about hell. We'll go to special effects. Anyway, let's talk briefly about heaven. Not as much, because it's not as interesting, unfortunately. So the New Testament, the Old Testament, heaven hardly gets a mention. In fact, I don't think it does really get a mention. Where God's presence gets talked about, the heavenly realm, but the heaven for the people, as far as I can find, it's not there. And again, if it is there, please show me, tell me where it is. So in the Old Testament, there isn't really a concept of everyone goes to heaven and everything's groovy. But in the New Testament, the idea of heaven develops, but it's very different to the idea of hell. Hell is kind of described almost like a place at different points. But when the New Testament speaks of heaven, and this is where you've got to get your head around this, it speaks of heaven more as a concept and a state of being. Heaven is what you are. So Jesus doesn't say, we're going to get to heaven, it's going to be lovely, puppies and cakes, sit in the cloud, play a harp. There's none of that. None of that is in the Bible. Heaven is like a mustard seed. It's like when you find treasure in a field. That's what heaven's like. That's not what but we don't know what it actually is. The only way I can try and explain it is that what Jesus and the writers are trying to get across is heaven is being with God. It's not really a heavenly city. It's about being in the presence of God. Imagine being with someone you really love. If you're with someone you really love and you love their company and their talk, it doesn't matter where you are, does it? It doesn't matter what the situation is, because you're in a place, aren't you, that isn't necessarily physical. And I think that's what heaven is about, and that's why I think the Bible is particularly clear. And even it's not clear on hell. There isn't a physical place that you go to where everyone's running around laughing. It's almost as if heaven is God. It's just God. And that's where we go. And this is hard for some people to grasp. I accept that. If you've been brought up to think, if you don't behave yourself, you're going to go one way or the other, that's it. There's two places you can go to, and that's one of them. Then it's really hard to grasp, well, actually, no. Because what the Bible seems to say is heaven is going to be with God. And the place is almost irrelevant. So is there a hell? I'm reaching the conclusion now. Is there a hell? Well, if there's an afterlife, there could well be. And I think if you take all of the different bits of the Bible, the New Testament particularly, you could argue there is some sort of place that isn't a nice place afterwards. But it's not the Hollywood one. It's not the volcanoes and the burning fires. That's just not biblical. And a hell of eternal punishment achieves nothing. It's pointless. Punishment is either meant to, you've done wrong, I'm going to punish you, or I've done wrong, I'm going to rehabilitate you. That's kind of what punishment is about. But to be eternally punished for no purpose makes no sense at all. How can a gracious and a loving God do that? You say, well, he's about justice. Well, we're lesser than God, aren't we? But we can forgive people all kinds of things without condition and without expecting a payoff. We can do that as humans. If we can do it, well, surely God can say, actually, and work it out. I'm not saying it says, doesn't matter, let's just move on. We work it out. And I think God is the same. I cannot see, when I see Jesus, I can't see a vindictive God who punishes disproportionately, eternally, in this kind of medieval hell. So is there a heaven? Well, there is talk of some form of afterlife. Revelation is the biggest picture, but you have to remember that Revelation is a heavily symbolic book. It's not giving us a literal plan. It gives dimensions of the city. They're crazy, but you're not meant to draw it. You're meant to draw meaning from it. So how do we deal with this? I mean, a lot of people, I think, deal with it by not thinking about it. That's usually the best way of dealing with things. But one of the ways of managing, I think, is to remember to talk about or to think about the big picture. Don't take individual verses. You can take an individual verse and say anything. You've got to see, well, what does all of it say? What's the sweep of it? And also, most importantly, what does Jesus say? Jesus doesn't really talk about heaven and hell. There is one particular parable, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which some of you might know, where there's a story of a great separation. And in that story, there's a man who's very rich, funny enough, don't know his name, and there's a poor man called Lazarus who's at his gate, and every day the rich man walks by and basically flicks the fingers up at him and says, forget it. And when they die, their roles are reversed, and the rich man is in hell. I can't remember which Greek word they use, and Lazarus is in heaven. But that story isn't about heaven and hell. That story is about how we treat people. So if you want to extrapolate from that story, there's a heaven and a hell. But you could also extrapolate from that story, you shouldn't lie on the ground for too long. Or, all kinds of things. There's lots of bits in that story, but the story is about justice. So the big question, which I'm sure you're all here for this evening, and I wish I'd put the right chapter down. The big question is, who's going where then? Who gets in and who doesn't get in? Who gets the good seats and who gets the hot seats? Well, Jesus talks about that, And this is what he said. He says, when the Son of Man comes as king and all the angels with him, he'll sit on his royal throne and the people of all nations will be gathered before him. So it's a very revelation-y kind of image, isn't it? All the people gathered on this great plain in front of God. Then he'll divide them into two groups, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the righteous people on his right and the others on his left. Then the king will come and say to the people on his right, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, come and possess the kingdom which has been prepared for you ever since the creation of the world. I was hungry, and you fed me, thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you received me in your homes, naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me, in prison, and you visited me." The righteous will then answer him, "When, Lord, did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we ever see a stranger and welcome you in our homes, or naked and clothe you? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" The king will reply, "Well, I tell you, whenever you did this for one of the least important of these members of my family, you did it for me." And then he'll say to those on his left, "Away from me, you that are under God's curse, away to the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. I was hungry, but you wouldn't feed me, thirsty, but you wouldn't give me a drink. I was a stranger, but you wouldn't welcome me in your homes, naked, but you wouldn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you would not take care of me." Then they would answer him, "When, Lord, did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not help you?" The king will reply, "I tell you, whenever you refuse to help the least important of these, you refuse to help me. These then will be sent off to eternal punishment, but the righteous will go to eternal life." That's the ticket that Jesus talks about. Where we actually end up, though, well, we can discuss that now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Certainly is an interesting subject. If you've enjoyed that, keep the conversation going. Now, for a lot of people, the idea of an afterlife isn't really an issue anymore. I think historically it's been a big deal. And I think in our current society here in the West, I'm not sure people are that bothered. But some people are. Bothered may not be the right word, but they have questions and wonder about these things. And again, it's almost whatever your kind of faith or spiritual beliefs are. Is there an afterlife? And if there is, what's it going to be like? So it's an interesting thing to talk about. So keep the conversation going. This sort of subject comes up quite regularly at the Baptist Church, Chelmsford Baptist Church. And so we're always up for a conversation around this. But look after yourself and look after your heart, because if there is a God out there, and I think there is, God's not going to be bothered about how religious you were or whether you knew the right songs or the right doctrines. God's going to be bothered about your heart. So look after that and listen to the teachings of Jesus. He told some good stuff. God bless. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.